Good afternoon. I am very happy to welcome you all to the second of today's panel discussions during this year's Vision Zero Cities Conference by Transportation Alternatives. Our panel today is titled Self-Enforcing Streets, Improving Safety and Reducing the Harm of Racial Bias. My name is Marco DiAquoi. I am Deputy Director at Transportation Alternatives. And I want to start with a quote that's just one day old from a US Congress member, Chuy Garcia, who at his keynote at yesterday's opening for this conference said the following: transportation is about much more than biking, buses, trains, and highways. It is as much a social justice and equity issue as housing, environmental justice, healthcare, and criminal justice, unquote. And when police targets majority Black and brown neighborhoods in New York City with criminal summonses for biking on the sidewalk in what was termed the new stop and frisk, that is a social and criminal justice issue, especially when a blind eye is turned against the same behavior elsewhere. And when those same Black and brown bicyclists bike on the sidewalk because the neighborhood lacks any safe biking infrastructure, and you want to avoid multi-ton speeding vehicles, that is a social justice and equity issue as a direct result of underinvestment in those very neighborhoods. And when one of New York City's first protected bike lanes reduced biking on the sidewalk by more than 80%, thus improving safety for all street users, while negating much of the need for any enforcement to begin with, it certainly raises the question whether we are prioritizing our resources in this transportation space and enforcement space wisely and equitably. I am very grateful for each of the panelists who are here today. Each person brings a wealth of experience and insight to this discussion. We are joined today by Cadidael of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City. We are joined by New York City Council member Carlina Rivera. We are joined by Dongho Chang, city traffic engineer for the city of Seattle in the state of Washington. Linda Bailey, Vision Zero director at the Washington, D.C. Department of Transportation, and Matt Rowe, urban planner with NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. The problems that we will highlight today are not uplifting or positive in any way. As part of the goal of Vision Zero, we are discussing how to prevent senseless carnage and loss of life in traffic and our street space. And also today, we are discussing the harms of policing as we know it, with deeply rooted structural racism, racial disparities in who is stopped, and far too often excessive use of force against drivers and others by police. At the same time, we know solutions to this, solutions that will help achieve both Vision Zero and will help address the harms of policing as we know it. And for that reason, I am grateful for today's panelists who will help illuminate the problems we're facing and discuss the solutions at hand, including discussing some of the challenges connected to those solutions. For example, life-saving automated enforcement and some of the concerns associated with it. Before I hand it over to our first panelist, I want to describe the format of today's panel. First, each panelist will briefly introduce themselves and give a brief presentation. Then, after each panelist has done so, which will be about 30 minutes from now, we will have a discussion. For the first part of the discussion, I will ask our panelists questions that I have prepared. And for the second part of that discussion, I will ask questions posed by you, our attendees today. So please post your questions in the chat space if you're on the Vision Zero Cities Conference Slack or LinkedIn. And for the panelists, I want to remind you during our discussion segment, please feel free to add your insight and response to a question, even if I don't ask you directly. So with that, I want to hand it over to our first panelist, Cadidael of the Center for Constitutional Rights.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks everyone who's involved with putting together this conference. Pleasure to be here. My name's Shayana Kadidal. Everyone except my parents calls me Shane, and I've been an attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City since just after 9/11. And for most of that 20-year run, I've worked primarily on the Guantanamo litigation, which is what people used to know CCR for before we won the landmark stop and frisk case in New York City, Floyd versus New York. Which we'll talk about a little bit today. So to begin, anybody following the debates on police violence of this year will have noticed, I think, two themes. First, the obvious one, that over-reliance on law enforcement to address various social problems, some of which are too minor to require intervention by armed officers, facilitates kind of a lot of these terrible violent encounters that we've seen, right? Whether it's, a minor offense like selling loose cigarettes or, traffic enforcement, we don't want armed officers always being the ones to respond to these kind of issues. But simultaneously, there's also another thread in these discussions that's come out later, which is a sense that actually too many very serious offenses go unaddressed. I think of a book like Ghetto-Cide, a bestseller from 2 years ago, talking about unsolved murders in the Black community and what a corrosive issue that is, right? So, today we're talking about the concept of self-enforcing streets, and I think that self-enforcing streets potentially presents a solution to both problems. By engineering the physical street environment, we can passively encourage safer behaviors without intervention by armed officers. And by automating enforcement of the rules with things like speed cameras, red light cameras, and the like, that can make enforcement both more equitable and more certain. And that latter bit, making enforcement more certain, is actually pretty important in this context. I think, anybody who's had to cross the street in New York City knows that there is under enforcement of traffic laws. But the very fact that moving violations are so common gives the police the right to pick out whoever they want to stop, and the law gives them that discretion. In a 1996 case called Wren versus United States, the Supreme Court held that if there is cause to stop a driver for some offense, in that case it was turning without a turn signal on, or you can think about kind of the cliched broken taillight. If the police have cause to stop you for a traffic infraction, the stop is constitutional no matter what the subjective intent of the officers was, right? If they didn't like the way you looked, or if they were really out there to enforce the drug laws, doesn't matter if they had cause based on a traffic infraction, right? And that turns traffic enforcement into a convenient means to facilitate racial profiling. This bears some comparison to stop and frisk, which is the unfortunate label for the New York Police Department's systematic practice of making hundreds of thousands of suspicionless stops of pedestrians primarily. I wish we had called it suspicionless stops rather than stop and frisk from the get-go, because it conveys a lot more what it's really about. Which is basically just that, the police stopping you without any particularized suspicion that you may have committed a crime, right? An enormous number of those stops were unconstitutional. The police lacked either probable cause to believe that a specific crime had occurred, or the lower reasonable suspicion standard, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, that permits a temporary investigative stop. But it took us years of litigation to force the department to record and disclose data on the reasons that people were getting stopped on the street, and then to essentially uncover the racial disparities, right? To figure out what we all now know, right? That stops, which had hit a peak of nearly 700,000 per year by 2011, were primarily targeted at Black and Latino men, who were an order of magnitude more likely to be stopped than white men. And despite all this, nearly 90% of stops resulted in no arrest or even no summons. And eventually it came out that the department felt that the primary justification for this program was that if young Black and Latino men thought they could be stopped for quote unquote no reason, they would leave guns at home, right? And even at that, only 0.2% of the stops in the peak year found weapons, right? So there are parallels to this with a lot of the traffic enforcement that we see. But the problem is that the stops in traffic enforcement are typically perfectly constitutional, right? As long as there's a technical violation, the courts are not going to inquire into the subjective motivations of the officers making the stop, right? Even though sometimes the numbers are just as bad, right? So for instance, in the first quarter of 2018, 99% of the jaywalking tickets in New York City went to Blacks and Latinos, right? Now, history gives us reason to doubt that New York's police department is capable of reform, since it took nearly a decade of litigation for that basic stop and frisk data to even be recorded, to force cops to write down why they were stopping people, even though it was happening hundreds of thousands of times a year. And it took several more years for the disparities to come out and for the numbers to finally drop in response to the litigation, right? And some of the same problems have resurfaced in policies like, sort of increasing turnstile jumping enforcement in the subways. But the bottom line is that same legal tools aren't there to stop inequitable traffic enforcement. Now, to an audience that I suspect is filled with a lot of city planners, I imagine the natural reaction to this is going to be that it's difficult to stop doing something that is convenient to the way policing is done today, right? But in fact, many cops hate doing traffic enforcement. Why? Well, primarily it's the fear that stops will blow up into violence, right? Now, for a motorist who gets pulled over, the act of getting pulled over and the waiting is the worst part of the stop. To a police officer, it's walking up to an unknown driver ensconced in a vehicle, right, where you can't see what their hands might be doing, right? It's that fear that makes these encounters dangerous. And you just kind of think about how many of the names we chant at Black Lives Matter protests come from incidents involving cars. Sean Bell, Philando Castillo, the list goes on and on. So again, over-reliance on armed officers to do the work that speed cameras can do produces deadly escalations, but it also leads to under-enforcement of rules that are there to prevent traffic violence. And there are some serious opportunity costs to having police officers work on traffic enforcement also, right? It encourages a view of the job of policing that is really kind of mechanistic, the idea that you just observe violations and write summonses, and that's the end goal of your profession, rather than doing what minority communities, I think, really need, which is more intensive investigation of unsolved serious crime, the sort of crime that isn't directly observed. And automated enforcement can be a solution here because it lowers the cost of enforcing traffic violations more widely, and that allows fines to be lower as well. Studies generally show that the certitude of enforcement is what drives changes in behavior more than the size of the penalty, and it kind of reduces this lottery element of getting infrequently caught and having to get hit with a big penalty when you do get caught, right? Which increases the perception of fairness that's so important in getting people to buy into complying with any rule. So there's more that we can say about kind of surveillance concerns and so forth, but I think we'll leave that for the questions.
Thank you so much, Shane. And next is Councilmember Carlina Rivera.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. Honestly, I'm really, really honored to be here with everyone. Of course, I have to thank Marco, and I have to thank Transportation Alternatives for inviting me to take part in this summit on Vision Zero Cities. This conversation is so important, investing in safe streets, a topic that has been very, very close to me and my work for some time now. For years, New York City led the nation in developing innovative solutions to our biggest urban challenges. And now that I'm a New York City Council member representing Manhattan's District 2, which is the Lower East Side, East Village, Gramercy, Kips Bay, as well as being an avid bicyclist, I have long sponsored and advocated for legislation that will hopefully bring real transportation solutions and safer streets to New Yorkers. So I've passed bills to ensure that bike lanes are maintained and protected when on-street construction occurs. And I'm also working to create an office of active transportation. Many advocates lovingly refer to it as the bike mayor. Clearly it exists in other cities, and including Seattle, DC, other places internationally. I'm always looking at policy that is passed there to really inspire my work as well. I advocated for the city's, New York City's first busway in my district, which is on 14th Street. And that's a great, I know we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of some of the enforcement, that automated enforcement that is taking place there. And I fought to really rebalance the city budget to invest funds that have been typically allocated for policing, militarized policing at that, to go towards our communities. So just this summer, in the face of COVID-19, we brought open streets to New York City through legislation that I introduced and then worked on with the Department of Transportation here in the city. This is, I would say, a bold initiative, but again, I was looking towards cities like Oakland and on the West Coast and taking cues from there. It was originally opposed by our Mayor de Blasio because of this perceived added strain on the NYPD. And that proved critical to our public health and economic recovery in the past few months, this initiative. So open streets would eventually lead to open streets restaurants, open streets schools. And that was always the vision when I first proposed it and introduced and drafted that bill, is to make sure that we're taking back our streets. And the priority is always the public, and see how we can utilize our space to lift up our families, but also our economy, which we're doing right now. And so with the successful, and it was a very rapid implementation of open streets, we proved that we do not need increased effort from law enforcement to bring safe streets to our communities. There were volunteers, we got business improvement districts involved, community boards citywide. They really stepped up to bring safe streets and increased outdoor spaces to their neighborhoods without additional NYPD presence. And why it was so important, because of the social distancing aspect, was really making sure we were also advocating that this was going to be the coalition of people who policed our streets. We didn't need NYPD there. We can do it ourselves if we all came together and were really united. And it's been working so far. And of course, there's always room for improvement. And following the success of our Open Streets program this summer, I think it's pretty clear now more than ever that when we invest in safe streets, we not only ensure protected transportation for all residents, but we have the potential to save money by reducing the need for police-led traffic enforcement. And we're at a nationwide reckoning with our law enforcement budgets, and New York City has the opportunity to lead in terms of that rebalancing and reinvesting. And for a long time now, we've been asking our police forces to do a lot operationally, when really it was culturally that we should have been focusing on in terms of their development. So divesting from traffic policing budget to reinvest in redesigning safe streets would prove beneficial to both law enforcement and of course the communities that they pledge to protect. So things like daylighting, barriers at intersections, they're going to do a lot more to make New York City safe than I think a police officer ever would. Unfortunately, as was mentioned, when I mentioned the cultural piece of it, and as was in the previous presentation, unfortunately, New York City has a really long history of racial profiling in traffic policing and enforcement. So stop and frisk, other methods of, the broken windows policing have led to this unacceptable culture of stereotyping, of harassment, of racism in the very systems that are designed to protect us. And so I'm very excited by this kind of idea of the automated traffic enforcement alternatives and the potential that they offer to address structural racism by creating self-police streets. And certainly we have to make sure that the data that we get from this new sort of tool that we're using, this technology, that data from these programs are protected. But I believe that this is the real crucial first step to beginning to solve bias policing and racial disparities and excessive use of force. I mentioned the busway in my community. We're using that automated enforcement. It's proven to be really successful. We started as the pilot. We made it permanent. We gave even a window to individuals so they would understand that enforcement was going to start in a real way. And it's been very, very successful. And I'm hoping that we could replicate that model in other parts of the city. And so, when I mentioned really reinvesting and investing particularly in safe streets, I always have to make sure that I'm balancing the people that do drive or the people that don't necessarily ride a bike as often as I do. Certainly don't want them to feel ignored or left behind. And so I want to be very clear that safe streets are for every single person in our cities. While much of the conversation, it often surrounds protected bike lanes as a hot topic. And I know one of the first bills I passed that I was incredibly proud of was to create that alternative protected bike lane. We know that providing dedicated space for bikers also ensures a safer commute for pedestrians. And so, for example, we often see bikers taking to the sidewalks because they just don't feel protected on our streets. So by investing in a redesign of our streets to accommodate both bikes and cars, we ensure that spaces dedicated to pedestrians are safe as well. So active transportation is incredibly popular in my district. So many members of my community, they walk, they bike. You even see scooters. You see Revel now here in Manhattan and in other boroughs, which are just the scooters. And it's imperative that we make conscious investments in safety design so that we can all share the streets as intended. I know when it's mopeds or motorized scooters, it has to be very, very responsive to my constituents. I have a few of what we call naturally occurring retirement communities, or NORCs. And that is where, generations of families, and particularly senior citizens, now live in clusters, right, in denser areas. And so I'm always trying to make sure that we are taking care of those NORCs, and understanding that whether it's a physical limitation or just maybe not really growing up with that sort of cycling culture, that I have to be responsive to that. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is this Office of Active Transportation that I'm really, really excited about. And that, again, I've been learning by looking at other cities and the policy that they're implementing, not just here in the United States, but also abroad. So if we're going to effectively pursue and implement truly safe streets, I think that we need to invest in the government infrastructure to thoroughly protect and advocate for all who use them. So back in November 2019, I introduced, it's called Introduction 1812 in the New York City Council, legislation that would establish a mayor's office of active transportation and then an active transportation advisory board. Per this bill, which again, everyone calls it the bike mayor bill, which is cool. It does more than just address bikes, it addresses everything, but I like it. We also have a people's bike mayor, shout out to Courtney, if she's watching. This Mayor's Office of Active Transportation and its accompanying advisory board, it would serve everyone from bikers to pedestrians to rollerbladers. I saw someone rollerblading today, it was great. And everyone in between by coordinating infrastructure and policy initiatives. So really it's just making sure that we're conducting outreach, we're reviewing information on complaints and violations, and then serving as a liaison between active transportation users, residents, and of course the government. So, understandably, this would require, some resources in terms of our city budget. And we know that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're really facing a fiscal crisis. But still, I believe that the establishment of such an office and an advisory board is going to be really critical to the future of safe streets in our city and cities nationwide. And we've seen the bike boom, quite frankly, and people want to walk to their local businesses and to work and to their kids' school. So the Department of Transportation can only handle so much. And so I'm excited to try to push not only this, but making sure that when it came to the Safe Streets Master Plan introduced by the Speaker of the Council, Corey Johnson, that we're really implementing some of that, which includes bus lanes and really just prioritizing people, pedestrians, people power transit, and of course, the MTA.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Carlina Rivera. And next is Dongho Chang, City Traffic Engineer with the City of Seattle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dongho Chang, and I'm the City Traffic Engineer for City of Seattle. I'm going to do a quick slideshow. So our street design and laws are really set nationally. There's some national policies and guidelines that we all follow in our states and cities that focuses on vehicle movement and efficiencies, and really do not accommodate and exclude people who are outside the vehicle. So you see, this is a state highway in North Seattle where a family is walking on the shoulder. There's a discontinuity of sidewalks. And what that family is doing, according to a law enforcement official, they can stop that family and saying that you're supposed to be walking facing traffic rather than following with traffic, and that you have to cross the street, but they cannot, because on this particular street, there's two signals between the two intersections. So we set up our traffic laws and how we develop our streets in an equitable way. And we put people at risk in many different ways. And we really have to rethink a transformational change on our street design and our street accommodation for all people, especially people who are the most vulnerable. In Seattle, African Americans represent 7% of our population, but they receive 26% almost quarter of the jaywalking tickets. It's very inequitable in terms of how our streets are enforced. And sometimes we put our law enforcement officials in that really precarious situation of enforcing these laws that are really not serving the community well. So we really have to think about our streets and how we serve our communities in a way that enhances the place that it is and how we move people and goods where it needs to, but really think about that safety aspect of it and how we create a equitable space for all users. This is a street design guidelines that we have in Seattle that's very much modeled after NACTO that looks at target speeds for these particular type of streets so that we have the safe operating environment for all modes. 60% of our streets are designed in this way. This is our residential streets. 2,400 miles are 20 miles per hour. They were set in 2016. They represent only 10% of the serious injuries and fatal collisions on these streets. And with using 2 years of before and after data, we saw a 20% reduction in all collisions and a 37% reduction in fatal and serious injury collisions with the reduction of speed limits. At the intersections of these streets where all the collisions do occur, we have 1,200 traffic circles. They reduced injury collisions by 97%. That's really dramatic. They reduced all collision by 90%. This is the locations where vehicles interact and vehicles and pedestrians interact. So if you thoughtfully address these intersections in a way that's context sensitive, you can dramatically impact safety. And if you think about how our streets are functioning, this street right here, if you were trying to travel down 20 miles per hour, you physically cannot. If you see a person coming the other direction and you're trying to make up time, you might do that 1 or 2 times, but then after backing up a block to get out of the way, you won't do that a second time. So it by design allows local access, emergency access, but it's really slow and it has that calming effect. Self-enforcing street design is really about how our streets are allocated and utilized. This is a street index in Seattle, Dexter Avenue, where we, based on just minor change in how the street is configured, dramatically improved efficiency. So the vehicle volumes on the street went from 5 lane to 1 lane in each direction with bike lanes, bus stops in lane. We improved vehicle carrying capacity by 12%, transit ridership up by 40%, bicycle usage is up by almost 40%. Travel time on the buses have been unchanged and the collisions are down 19%. And you can do physical changes like raising the intersections, raising the crosswalks, putting speed cushions. It has dramatic impact to people who are speeding. One person will try going 40 miles that raised crosswalk, lose a pan and probably hit their head. And then next time it will dramatically change their behavior. Self-enforcing design, low cost, things you can do very quickly. Automated enforcement, I just want to say that it does have impact, but it's not a panacea. This is our data. 96% of the violators received their infraction and paid and did not get another violation. So it does change behavior. It does improve safety by reduction in collisions, 71% reduction in all collisions during the active hours. But again, we're using the fines to improve safety by physically providing projects along these routes. And automated enforcement red light, again, the data shows that it's very effective. 20 locations with 3 years before and after data. We reduced angle collision by almost 50%, pedestrian collision by 1/3, rear end collision by 15%, and all collision by 23%. But again, one drunk driver does not change that behavior, right? So we really have to think about how do we create an environment where all users are safe. This is a temporary measure. We need to do some physical changes. And what are those physical changes? These are really listening to the community, seek what they're experiencing and changing our environment so that it really serves the community. We have a street in Southeast Seattle where we actually closed the street because there was racing happening and made it into a playground. So being equitable, really thoughtful about how we allocate resources and engineering our street for that safe design. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dongho. And next up is Linda Bailey, Vision Zero Director with the DC Department of Transportation.
Thanks, Marco. Hold on 1 second while I get my screen share going here. Okay. Everybody see that okay? I'm Linda Bailey, as Marcus said, with the District of Columbia Department of Transportation here in Washington. I'm excited to be here today with Transportation Alternatives, such a great leader on transportation throughout the country. And excited to see some of our own advocates from DC on the participant list. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our short-term turnaround responses to fatal crashes, a highlight of some of the things we're doing. Many of you know this, but the Vision Zero program. Many of you are familiar with this, but the Vision Zero program in DC is part of the mayor's initiative. This is also Jeff Meridian, our director. And really, we're trying to pull out all the stops to make changes that will improve safety immediately and in the short term. And our short-term fatal crash response program is part of that. So in general, I'd say Vision Zero, it's really critical that we follow the data. This is just a heat map of injury crashes from the last 4 years here in the district. And you can see fatalities are a much smaller number of those. And yet, when we look at fatalities, over half of all our fatalities are happening on 35 of our arterials. So we know that going out after fatalities is meaningful in terms of making those changes because those are often arterials that we need to be looking at in many cases. So it's part of, I'd say a lot of what Dongho said, I would second. Those are great ideas and things we're trying to do here also. But this is the short-term turnaround work that we're doing. So one of the primary things we do post-fatal crash is we go out and do typically right now a virtual site visit, sometimes complemented by an in-person site visit, depending on conditions, and look at the site and discuss options for apparent problems or those that come out of the actual crash report. And those are not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes problems are apparent upon view that may or may not have anything to do with that specific crash. But again, going back to like, when we go out to a site, we know we're someplace where other crashes are most likely occurring or other close calls or injury crashes have happened. And so we are interested in all kinds of things that can be helping with this. So this right here is a site of a crash from this June. We lost a young man here in the district who was jogging across the street and was struck by a driver that headed southbound on Piney Branch, which is a arterial in Northwest DC. And in July, we put together this design with temporary materials to create a neck down, you can kind of see here, as well as median refuge islands. We also installed rapid rectangular flashing beacons, also known as RRFBs, to alert people driving. This is the arterial, that this is a crossing in front of a school right here, as well as a church on this side. So this is also pretty proximate to one of our major transit stops. So there is quite a bit of pedestrian traffic on here, although it's kind of a neighborhood character street in general. So this neck down, plus the median refuge island, plus the rapid flashing beacons. After installation, or before installation, we did what we call a step out survey to measure yielding behavior by motorists. And we measured about 60% of motorists were yielding to people walking in the crosswalk. Post installation, we measured yielding behavior of 90% with the neck down RFB and the median refuge island. So that's a significant improvement in the safety of this intersection, and we'll be looking to do this as a more permanent installation in the future. That's just one example of a very quick turnaround project where we went out to the site and we saw a lot of opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit next about our major arterials and speed management. This is the site of another fatality that's actually occurred last month. We had a fatality against this pole right there that you can see in the distance. Basically, this is a major arterial, as I stated, in Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. Someone entering this intersection failed to make this turn and it was a single vehicle fatality. This is a type of fatality where we look at it, we know that speed is a critical issue. And so we need to figure out a way to manage those speeds in order to really make a change in the safety for everyone on the roadway at that location. And again, just getting back to like, we try to go to the location of the fatality, look at the whole holistic view of the site and what's going on there. So this is a case where we're looking at automated enforcement. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we see with automated enforcement. And Dongho, you have some awesome statistics there also. But I'll just show, we have 3 of our high citation locations in very high volume streets, major arterials. What you see over time is, if you look at this is about a 3-year period. It's showing you that the violation rate of drivers passing the camera goes from, depending on the camera, over 2% of all drivers to around 1.5%. And over time, we're seeing it really go down to about 0.5% or 1 in 200 drivers who are passing the vehicle. So we are seeing an improvement on the speeding behavior, which is what we're trying to target directly with that. And even more detail, we looked at the different percentiles of speeds after installation of a camera. This is on DC 295, our local expressway. You can see the 99th percentile, so that's 1 in 100 drivers. Or if you have 10,000, or I think some of these have around 70,000 vehicles per day. So that's 1% would be, I'm doing quick math, 700 vehicles a day. That speed went down from 72 to 61. So that's a really critical decline in the speeding, particularly in that very high speed, very risk-loving kind of behavior that we're seeing there. So that's good news for us when we look at our speeding behavior. And then this is the site of yet another fatality that's occurred last year. These are some of our local advocates, Ron Johnson and Christy Kwan with Families for Safe Streets. This is at the site of a fatality on Martin Luther King Avenue, Southeast. And really, when we talk about this, a big issue coming up with automated enforcement are the equity impacts. And we're always trying to weigh those impacts of the cost of the fines versus the cost of human life and injury and trauma from those crashes. So that's really how we're looking at that side of it, the equity side of automated enforcement. We do believe it's overall improving things. It is definitely has a cost impact because the fine is associated with it. We do have some really critical legislation that was passed in 2018 that does provide a relief valve for those who do have fines that they're not able to pay. And that's part of the package of what we're looking at for really trying to get to a better place and also improve safety across the district for all communities. That's all I have for me. And I'll pass it back to our next speaker, which I believe is Matthew.
Thank you so much, Linda. And next up, yes, is Matt Rowe. Quickly before I pass it, it has been turned over to Matt, but I just want to remind all viewers, if you have questions, to please post them so we can ask our panelist. Matt Rowe with NACTO.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Rowe. I'm the technical lead at NACTO. My prehistory is that I grew up in Brooklyn. I spent 7.5 years working for the New York City Department of Transportation. And I've been working with NACTO to help more or less all the major cities in the United States and cities around the world learn from one another. We think that peer-to-peer sharing and learning is the best way to learn. We find that just like you probably want to hear from your peers, those of us who work at cities and have worked there really want to hear from our peers who have that experience. And so I often rely on our network, of which Dongho and Linda are major pillars. Because we work all around the country and all around the world, we have gotten to see the dramatic and often underappreciated ways in which the confluence of people moving to places that are less walkable, especially people of color, especially people with low incomes, as urban centers have become more expensive, how that has combined with the history of 20th century street design in the United States to make our streets all over the country a lot more dangerous. There we go. That 20th century development is failing us. This is not a map of this is not just a population map, is a way to put this. This is from the Dangerous by Design report from the Complete Streets Initiative, Smart Growth America, Complete Streets Coalition, Smart Growth America. And what we've seen when we look even at the macro level, at the micro level, is that the major arterial streets, the streets that we built to move a lot of traffic, are where a lot of our injuries are happening. That's also where you have to catch the bus. That's also where you have to cross the street to catch the bus. It's also where you have to cross to get from your neighborhood to your school or to the stores. And if you live more or less anywhere except for a richly transit-oriented place, you're going to be doing that, and you're going to be at risk. So these major streets, these are some of the stats that I'll throw at you, and I promise I'll be less dry after this. But arterial streets are what FHWA and states and some cities call their major streets. They're only about 1 out of 25 miles in your city, but they're where about half of the people who are being killed in motor vehicle crashes are being killed. And about a third of the people who cross the street, get hit by a driver and die, lose their lives, are crossing mid-block on a major street. Half of these are state-owned, not city-owned. That's an important thing because I think most of us work with our cities. Most of us have work for or work with cities, but there are state and national problems that we need to address together as a movement. A lot of these streets are designed to exclude. The data bears it out. This is data from Atlanta, from the Atlanta region, but we know that these major streets, pound for pound, do a lot more damage. What that tells us is that the enforcement of the last 75 years really can't fix design failures. We can't make this street work unless we change how it works. Everyone here is doing something legal. Those women are being cut off by that turning truck, which has a leading turn signal, and they're walking with the light, and he's turning with the light, and they're all at risk, frankly. The other thing about major streets is they produce another kind of bike injury, another kind of pedestrian injury. This is Jermaine Robinson. He was stopped for going through a light in Hillsboro, Oregon, which is a few miles outside of Portland. He was tased. He was thrown to the ground by the police officer who stopped him, and he suffered a herniated disc. His arrest was for resisting arrest, as many of these arrests are. I bring this up because he was not found guilty of resisting arrest. He was eventually convicted of riding without a light and signal noncompliance. I want you to think about how many times you have ridden without a light or not failed to comply with a signal, whether as a person on a bike or as a person walking or as a person driving. I have never been thrown to the ground and tased for doing that. One of the reasons that we have those laws that make those things illegal is we have this perception that as a system, we have to make all the things illegal that aren't safe. Okay. So the problem with that is that it doesn't make people safer. That people don't actually put themselves at risk without a reason. I took this photo on a major street in an American city, and I saw these kids cross the street. They're all girls, and I assume they're siblings. None of the drivers stopped for them. Multi-lane street, not a single driver stopped for them. Isn't that remarkable? It's remarkable, and it was remarkable to me because the drivers could just as easily have yielded, but they didn't because street design told them not to, and because racism told them not to, frankly. It's impossible to make a good decision if the infrastructure doesn't let you. This street they made it across, but this street had 6 people killed or severely injured in 5 years on 1 mile. It doesn't actually have that many cars per day. This is not a lot more than Vanderbilt Avenue in Brooklyn carried in its pre-COVID form. But it's 76 feet across, and of course they're speeding. This is a different street. Some of you might recognize it. I won't tell you where it is, but it's, okay, I will tell you where it is. It's in downtown Austin, Texas. I took this picture too. These people were also crossing against the light, incidentally. And there's really just nothing comparable in terms of the risk on this street. I think this is worth thinking about, not just because of the obvious design considerations, but because of who gets the safe streets and who doesn't, and the massive disparities involved there. This is a really complicated way of saying when you're crossing the street, you probably can't actually tell how fast cars are going, especially when they start going over about 25 or 30 miles per hour. This is some of the science behind why pedestrian crossings have to be made safer by us as designers, engineers, planners, decision makers, and why we have to lower speed limits. My next point is that speed limits really do work to set expectations and to set the pace on a street. And this is an example from Chicago, where with some pretty light touch restriping, organization of the roadway a little bit, but the same number of lanes, with what were in some parts advisory bike lanes and some part bike lanes, 43% fewer people were driving more than 10 miles over the limit afterward. That's a big deal because that's where the risk is, as Dongho has talked about, and as Linda's talked about. NACTO released new guidance on setting safe speed limits on urban streets. It's pretty simple. If it's an alley or shared street and you expect people, or really anywhere that you expect people to be walking in the same lane, as it were, as motor vehicle traffic, it's 10 miles per hour. If it's a small street and you expect people to bike on it, or you expect people to cross it anywhere without the benefit of a signal or stop sign, then it's 20 miles per hour. If it's a bigger street and you can signalize it and you can make it safe to cross, 25, great. But even on those bigger streets, there's some places where it shouldn't be 25. Sometimes the conflict density, the number of people using the street, the difficulty of driving safely on that street just makes it more reasonable to lower the speeds. Speed limits themselves can't change everything. They're really just a start. Better design does lead to easier decisions by everybody and better decisions by everybody using the street. Oakland used some of the interim design or quick build toolbox operational toolkit, as New York City DOT calls it, that New York City really innovated with and enhanced it, added a splash of color. This was in response to a senior pedestrian being killed by a driver. I know that the one thing that Americans like even less than experts is international examples, but this is Paris. I have to share this because there are very few US examples, but increasingly common in Western Europe. You'll find breaking up multi-lane crossings even on one street. So I'm giving you this as something to kind of think about aspirationally. Can you figure out ways to use those same tools that have been very successful in New York and in Seattle and DC, all over the United States, to provide ways to pinch down the motor vehicle lane at exactly the point where people are most vulnerable, where they're crossing, right? It's only really about 8.5 or 9 feet from this concrete to this line. And that really slows down the drivers as they go through. There's a bus lane here. So that's one of the reasons that Paris decided to do this, is that if people cross the bus lane, well, the bus lane only has one bus every, say, 2 minutes. They are going to cross it, and they need someplace that's at least a little bit safer. Okay, fine, it's Paris. It's every 30 seconds, I'll admit. New York City innovated, I kind of hate the word innovation, but New York City invented a few really useful things. And I want to give credit where credit's due, because my former colleagues there, entirely after I left, by the way, I had nothing to do with this, used the tools of essentially of highway traffic engineering, these posts and markings and parking lot speed bumps to create slow turn conditions and to make it easier for drivers to make better decisions, right? They no longer expect all the other drivers to be cutting the corner. They expect them to be slowing down, and that is self-reinforcing. That has spread. This is an example from Los Angeles. By the way, those are called K71 bollards. It's like Borsad at the deli, asked by name. And I want to bring up an example that NACTO is directly involved in. The Global Designing Cities Initiative implemented this in Bogota. This is one of the first street redesigns that that group did there. Bogota has long been a leader in active transportation, in bus rapid transit and sustainable transport, and has long been a leader in safety analysis. So they had the data, they knew where the crashes were happening, and this was one of the places they were happening. Why? Well, the speeds were somewhat high. They weren't as high as we find on a major street, but it was busy and there wasn't much room, and the school on the street lets out, and the drivers are speeding through, and students are sharing a bike, which is probably illegal in a lot of states, and we should probably make that legal, because I don't think very many white people get stopped for that. The goal here was, well, there were a lot of for-hire vehicles, just like in New York and a lot of other American cities, microbuses, and they were speeding. They have every incentive to speed. So the redesign really made it impossible to speed through, similar to Dongho's neighborhood traffic circle example. The physical design made it such that a much lower speed, really a biking speed, became the norm. And people bike in line with cars instead of kind of waving around them. So kind of a high volume bike boulevard. Maybe not in all ages and abilities condition, but a lot safer than it was without enforcement. I want to bring up this. It's a brand new object. Detroit just implemented this. So maybe by the time we post this, there'll be photos, but it was raining, so they didn't have photos. This is to say that in the United States, we've long been hesitant about doing multi-lane raised crosswalks, but we can do them. We really can, and we can design them right, and we can design them to be safe for buses. New York City has designed speed cushions to work well for buses, and many other cities have been doing them at a small scale. Detroit is going to make a major investment in speed humps and speed cushions. You might think of them as conventional traffic calming, but they're less conventional when you build 4,000 of them a year. And that's in direct response to the uproar there over speeding during COVID. And the residents of Detroit are at direct risk when people speed on major streets and minor streets alike. They know it. Design alone can't do it, and that's in a way my biggest point. If we want transportation justice, we have to invest in it. This is how Oakland decided to spend their resurfacing money. They call it the smoothening, which is a brilliant name. So look for that on Twitter. I don't know, if I was more prepared, I would have put a hashtag up, but the smoothening. So what they found was that they had historically been putting their resurfacing money, repaving the streets in the places where the streets got worn out the quickest, and in downtown and places like that. And they realized that if they allocated just by the share of the city's population, they were missing people. And they were missing, or the share of street miles, they were missing people. And so instead of just going to the major streets, they actually resurfaced a lot of the local streets, because that's where people spend their time, at least in Oakland. And they found that, just honestly, people felt as if having an unpaved street really was a direct sign of disinvestment by the city. And they were right. And Oakland took steps to correct that by putting its money really where its mouth was, on equity, and distributing the funds based on the share based in large part, on the share of the underserved population. So the other last example of this, and this is obviously far beyond street design, but it's almost more basic. This is lighting in Detroit. The blue stuff is people who are killed while walking in darkness. And as the street lighting improvements have come on, that number has come down, the overall numbers come down. Signals are a silent partner for safety, and I want to note that this is another area that New York City has done exceptionally well. And I want to think about what the leading pedestrian interval, I like to call it a pedestrian head start, has to do with the law. and with making it legal to walk and bike. Well, many of you know that as the number of pedestrians, leading pedestrian intervals increased in New York, as New York City DOT implemented them rapidly and at very low cost, the City Council stepped in to actually make it legal to bike on a walk signal, so that you can go use the LPI as many designers intend for it to be used without risk of arrest. Incidentally, I was stopped once after the law was passed, but before it came into effect, for biking through a walk, meaning on a walk, but against a red light. It was an all red. I argued my way out of it by not answering any questions. But that's not what happens to everybody. So where does this leave us? Well, we need to think about the law, not just the design. We need to think about why the law takes the driver's side in a crash. Well, in part because we've made it illegal to cross. It's very easy to take the driver's side in the crash. It's very easy to say, well, the law says the pedestrian is supposed to yield to any motor vehicles in the roadway. Well, that's fine, but speeding's a real issue. And it's even illegal to start crossing on a flashing don't walk. Maybe that's another thing that we can think about in line with the leading pedestrian interval legalization. There are a lot of others, and I think that this group could come up with them. I think, frankly, this audience could. But I want to leave you with that when we change the way the street actually works and we invest in things that actually make us safer, we get better outcomes. And that when we really go beyond even self-enforcing to think, well, what's the art of street design? It's really making the thing that's legal and the thing that's safe into the thing that's convenient, and the thing that people will actually do, or making the thing that people are actually doing into the thing that's safe and the thing that's legal. We can do that as designers, as lawmakers, and as citizens. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. So I want to take a brief moment to examine police traffic enforcement a bit more. Shane, you mentioned the 1996 Supreme Court decision that validated even subjective, highly discretionary police stops. I pulled up a short excerpt of the ACLU's condemnation of that ruling just to add more detail to it. And the ACLU stated that in practice, the 1996 Wren decision has given the police virtually unlimited authority to stop and search any vehicle they want. Every driver probably violates some provision of the vehicle code at some time during even a short drive, because state traffic codes identify so many different infractions. For example, traffic codes define precisely how long a driver must signal before turning. Vehicle equipment is also highly regulated. A small light bulb must illuminate the rear license plate. Tail lights must be visible from a particular distance, and all equipment must be in working order at all times. And the ACLU then goes on to conclude that if the police target a driver for a stop and search, which could be a subjective, biased, and racist decision, all they have to do to come up with a pretext for a stop is to follow the car until the driver makes an inconsequential error or until a technical violation is observed. And these types of discretionary stops are very similar to other types of policing, as we know it from stop and frisk, that are enforced in a highly discretionary manner. So I just wanted to add a little more detail to what you shared, Shane. But Shane, I have a question for you. You mentioned how people's perceptions of fairness by police impact one's adherence to safety laws, something that Tracy L. Mears has researched. Can you speak more to what you mean by that?
Boy, there's an awful lot there, and I know some of the questions in the chat have touched on the idea of sliding scale penalties and other things. And I want to recommend to everybody an article that Marco wrote in the Fordham Urban Law Journal. Maybe Marco, you're kind enough to punch the citation in or the URL to it that touches on a lot of these things. Yeah, there is basically that there's a decent amount of literature out there on the idea that a fine doesn't have to be, like the fines that you read about in the newspapers in Finland, where you get fined for speeding 1% of your annual income. A little tiny kind of slap, smaller than the speeding ticket amounts that we get now, but something that's delivered with certitude, with a lot more frequency than the kind of random lottery enforcement that we have now, is going to be in your mind more when you're deciding, should I go a little bit faster or not, right? It's kind of common sense, right? That the more likely you are to get penalized in some fashion, or to really be observed, I suppose, by the law violating it, the more likely you are to change your behavior, right? I mean, this touches a little bit on the surveillance concerns that people have also raised, which are primarily around the idea that if you have red light cameras or speeding cameras, you're having more cameras out in public, and there's no legal barrier to surveilling things that are happening in public in plain view under the Fourth Amendment. And the worry is mainly that law enforcement may store all this information and use it later on to assemble cases against people. The civil libertarian concern about storage is not so much that we should have a right to lie about where we were on a certain day or not. And so we don't want to edit ourselves, right? We don't want to self-police ourselves and think, well, I don't want to leave the house now because I'm in the middle of a divorce case and I don't want my, the law to be able to discover that I'm going to some place when I'm not really commuting to work or something like that, right? We don't want to be self-censoring, right? But that self-censoring is essentially what we do want when it comes to people's driving behavior. And that, I think, is why the more frequent threat of smaller fines is just as effective as getting fined 1% of your salary when the policeman happens to be there with a radar gun.
Thank you, Shane. So Matt, you highlighted a different concept of safety. My question is actually for Councilmember Rivera. What does safety mean to you in the context of transportation and street safety? What does it mean to you and to your constituents?
Well, I think, what we're discussing today in terms of reducing harm, that's why with something as recent as the Open Streets program, the social distancing piece and who was going to enforce that was really important. We didn't think that NYPD should be involved at all. And so there were social distancing ambassadors. And though we had to work that out and it was a negotiation process in and of itself, I thought that was the step that we needed to take when we're talking about creating self-police streets. And so the automated traffic enforcement alternative and that potential that it offers to address a lot of the structural racism when it comes to safety and who's enforcing it, that's something that I'm just going to continue discussing. And I think that transportation is the great equalizer. And for everyone in New York City, most of New Yorkers, they don't own a car. And as I mentioned, I'm always trying to be sensitive to the people that own a car for a number of reasons, whether it's for work, whether it's because you have physical limitations, I understand. But that idea of safety to me is that the pedestrian comes first on the street. Public transit is prioritized. And when we're trying to think of how we can incorporate it the right way when it comes to enforcement, clearly the NYPD has, this horrible history of policing in communities of color. So for me, being a proud Latina, being a woman of color in a community where, I have 10,000 families living in public housing here, that is who I'm thinking of first and foremost, the people who are very reliant on a bus network, who want to walk in the streets without being harassed by police, who still want to feel safe and protected, but understand that we're providing the sort of subsidies that people actually need. Maybe it's, maybe the ferry service isn't the right subsidy for right now, but how are we looking at City Bike? How are we trying to improve our bus network and implement other busways in other parts of the city? So safety is being able to access transportation, but also feeling safe in whatever decision that you make. So that's my job, right? To legislate when possible to make people feel safer crossing the street. I think the redesign, something like the LPI when I'm on my bike was a game changer. Making sure that we're creating those alternative bicycle lanes when there's construction. And if you've ever been in New York City, we're constantly under construction. And then ensuring, as I mentioned, that people who are maybe on their mopeds and scooters, like they're following the law, that we're doing the right educational campaigns in the language that people prefer, being as diverse as our population is. And then that average senior citizen who's walking around feels like this city is being designed for them.
Thank you, Council Member. So there's been no shortage of solutions to designing the streets for safety, and I don't think there's big disagreement about what works. What, however, sometimes people have difficulty kind of grasping or imagining, I should say, is changing the way that policing happens. And so I want to pose a straightforward but maybe not so simple question to any panelist who wants to answer. Should police traffic enforcement as we know it be dismantled?
This is Dongho, and I think that's a really a goal that we should have, right? So transportation is a activity that we as humans do. Second highest cost for a family to be able to, it's actually people spend in Seattle area and King County more on transportation than food. And to have a ability to access our street network without the fear of getting hurt. So I think the goal is to design our streets so that that can be done. I think our priority is going to be a little while for our cities, because we are built in a very automobile centric way. And because of the infrastructure that we have in place, it's going to take some time. So I think there's a lot of solutions that needs to be changed. Our traffic laws needs to be changed so that it changes the paradigm to more the vulnerable users, and then people who are speeding, who are running through red lights. Those can be all automated so that people self-enforce until we get to the point where we have our infrastructure in place so that they can self-enforce with engineering.
Thank you, Dongho. Anyone else has any comments on that?
Real quick, Marco, I think there are obviously some that I think are more difficult to enforce without an officer there in person, right? I mean, drunk driving is one I think that you've mentioned that's kind of come to mind. Some of that turns on the kind of technical legal aspects of, what does the officer have to observe? Do we have the right essentially to kind of insist on the equivalent of automated enforcement, right? I mean, if it were a question of, an officer can walk up to you and ask you to take a breathalyzer right away and make you do it, that's somewhat automated, right? But that's not really exactly how the law works, right? So it becomes more complicated at the margin. But Dongho's basic answer, I think, is dead on, right? For the vast majority of infractions, and there are many, as you pointed out with that quote from the ACLU's press release after Ren. You want to have it be kind of as objective as possible, which means automated.
So it seems, that there is agreement, at least among our panelists here, that automated enforcement is something that needs to be part of the solution. Linda, can you speak a bit more about your experience with automated enforcement in DC, specifically some of the concerns that have been raised around placement and any other concerns?
Yeah, thanks. So our automated enforcement program has been around for a while. It's one of the country's largest and oldest, I believe. And so what we're really looking at right now, we're in the process of integrating our automated enforcement program into the work we do at the DOT, at the Transportation Department. I think it's really critical because we see it as Dongho said, like we need to redesign things. Sometimes that takes time, depending, especially on a larger project. And we want to see it as a bridge to getting there versus the end state. And that's really how we're approaching it. And I think that automated enforcement citations in general are one of the highest number of complaints to our elected officials. It's what I've heard from their offices. Is one of the biggest things people like to call and complain about. And maybe it's because, frankly, speeding is very acceptable. It's very socially acceptable in our country. And people who may consider themselves quite law-abiding regularly do it virtually, like literally every day, multiple times, right? And we don't have a lot of frequent kind of offenders or people who get multiple tickets. I think over 90% of our citations go to people who get one. So it's mostly people who realize it, they change their behavior, as I showed you on speeding. So what we're really trying to focus on is getting to that behavior we want to see, and not so much on the punishment side of it. One thing I did want to pivot to, just to talk a little bit about, when I was talking about the post-fatal crash site visits, we do those with our police department because they actually investigate every one of those crashes. And crash investigation is something we really rely on our police department for. And that's kind of an interesting thing. I hadn't really thought about that, but that just came to mind when you mentioned your last question about kind of moving away from police enforcement. One of the things I've learned working more closely with them since I came to DDOT a year and a half ago is that these crashes are investigated, every crash technically is investigated as a criminal matter and is subject to many lawsuits and other litigation. So there's kind of a big space there that's already kind of carved out for criminal intent or criminal behavior, however you want to frame it. And I think it's really interesting to think about how to untangle that and get to like what Matthew was saying, where you say, like, we make something that's safe, convenient. What's the other thing, Matthew? I'm gonna forget now.
Legal.
And legal, the same thing. And that's what we want to design for, because we really want it to be intuitive. And the thing that people complain about, I can tell you right now, is this term speed trap, right? When they feel like it's intuitive to drive whatever it is, 55 miles an hour, despite the fact that it's posted at 35, right? So that's the thing that people hate the most. And that's where we really are coming in and engaging with our ATE program at the district. And integrating their work much more into DDOT. The one thing I'll say about placement is like we do use data to place them. We also use residential complaints. So they're in high demand. Ironically, the two things that I think council members hear most about are both the complaints about getting citations and wanting a camera near somebody's house. So those are they're high. They're very potent from that perspective, and we hope to kind of integrate them more with the rest of our safety program as time goes on.
Thank you, Linda. So as we're coming to the end, I want to pose a little bit of an open-ended question, and I'll ask the panelists to be very brief, to spend just 20 seconds or so to answer it. What do you see as the main barrier or barriers to having streets optimally designed for safety and to achieve this type of enforcement that we have been discussing today? And I want to start with Council Member Carlina Rivera. You have been talking about your budget work and other legislation. So I want to start with you with that question.
Well, I think, some of our challenges are just the political will. Many of my council members, I will admit, do not consider transportation issues a priority. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to get the conversation going. And, I'm a proud cyclist. People might call me like, oh, like you're like the crazy bike lady, but it is just, I'm not the one that's getting ticketed, as we mentioned. People that are encountering police officers and getting ticketed are predominantly delivery workers. Those are immigrants, those are low-income people. And so, the issues that we're all facing, which is just safe routes to do your job, to have access. A lot of that is not going to be solved by ticketing or this over-policing. And so how I try to approach these conversations is that holistic, comprehensive approach, which is, using that intersectional lens of structural racism and looking at how we can protect that everyday person, whether they be a cyclist or a pedestrian. So I think a lot of it is, once you have the conversation, you see the statistics, you see what is possible, you see the ideas that are out there and all the talent that we have to implement it. It's political will. So if you don't have that person representing you or even willing to have that conversation, then we have to move to make sure that we're electing them.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I'm going to pose the same question to our other panelists, but with a warning to limit your answer to a single sentence because we are practically over time. So starting with Matt Rowe, what do you see as the biggest barriers to having streets optimally designed for safety?
I want to say, honestly, at a national level, it's really that we keep pumping money into adding car infrastructure, and we don't pump it into making the streets safer.
Thank you. And Linda?
Can I just say level service?
Yep, thank you. Dongho?
Yeah, it's our policies and laws that really gear towards vehicle efficiency and then the funding, how it's funded.
Thank you. And Shane?
You know, in a democracy, always the same problem, explaining it to the public in a way that they get it very quickly.
Wonderful. We have come to the end of the panel, and to each of our panelists, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insight with us today, and to all attendees and to the amazing staff at TA. Thank you very much and have a great day.